everyone, and welcome back to episode 3 with Senator Kim on just, our democracy, our country, our world, and what we want to do to make it better. Senator Kim, thank you so much for being here with us again.
It's my pleasure to be here. And really, I'm fine with you calling me Senator Kim, but everybody should just call me Kim. That's my name. And that's so feel free to just call me Kim. You don't have to always put Senator in front of it. But it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, as always, for your incredible leadership. And I look forward to our discussion.
Me too. I'm pumped to talk to you. So, something that's been weighing on my mind for the last little bit has been like the rise of the alt-right movement, and how, I feel like when I was in school, what I was taught about lower C conservatism is not really what, now all of a sudden it's like the right represents not believing in science or not giving women the right to choose things. I don't know when that shifted from what we learned in school to be what lower C meant. And I kind of wanted to discuss this because truthfully, I struggled to wrap my brain around it, especially within a Canadian context, because the one thing I'll give America a bit of credit for is they've really put their issues on blast and talk about it in a way that we don't here in Canada. So yeah, I mean, is that can we chat about that? I feel like that is.
Yeah, I wish yes, I'm happy to chat about it. I wish I understood it myself. I do think some of it is rooted in, for sure it's rooted in discriminatory attitudes, myths, ideas, and hierarchies, and then it gets blended with anti-intellectual, anti-knowledge. Almost like it gets characterized as anti-elitism as well. So there's a mixture. You see people who are both, sometimes are described as more fiscally conservative but progressive in their ideas. And I think of the term like the progressive conservatives. They're in some ways, some of their policies in the day were seen as more progressive than some of the more left-leaning folks of today. And and this is, we may be heading into election. I'm not expressing something partisan at this stage. I'm saying the reality is what we're talking about seems to be, and what we saw in the States, or I guess what we saw amplified in the States, particularly with the last election, was the fact that there's almost an appeal, an anti-progressive appeal, where people feel like they've been left behind somehow. And I think, what shocked many of us to see people who would be negatively impacted by the decisions that were being promoted, like the economic decisions, the racial decision, the legal system decisions, the healthcare system decisions, people who would be most negatively impacted were joining this, this lurch to say, we don't want public health care. We don't want supports for poor people. We don't want, we don't want supports for people who are new to the country, who are immigrants or refugees. We don't, as though it was somehow self-protective, when in fact it wasn't. And so that's why I think it engaged in some of the, it appealed to the most discriminatory, insecure attitudes of people, rather than encouraging people to, and what I hope has happened a bit during this pandemic is, in some ways, it's encouraged people to think better of how we take care of each other. Not everybody, and there's huge areas where that hasn't happened, where capitalism and corporate interests have taken priority, and the middle class has been prioritized over working poor and people who are economically living with the most economic disadvantage and racial and health disadvantages. I'm not suggesting that we've seen, great things, but I do hope that some of what we've experienced because of the pandemic means that people will be more willing to work together on some of these issues. Although I am worried about, the rise of as it's exemplified in the anti-vaccination ideas that somehow this is a sign, you know, that we're getting microchips. I mean, the conspiracy theories and the way it appeals to people's insecurities and discriminatory attitudes is horrific. And I wish I understood more about it. I do think part of it is about providing information. Like if you don't provide information and you're not clear, or you don't follow through on the commitments you make, in some ways it feeds those kinds of attitudes amongst people who don't have other avenues to get the information, whether it's because they don't have education or they have limited literacy issues. You know, and I'm not just saying it's just those individuals, because we see it's in the interests of people who have a lot of money to keep people thinking that, you know, it's poor people who are dragging us down, that we can't afford social assistance and we can't afford health care, and that it's, you know, and so it appeals to people in a way that is so simplistic. And I think it appeals to people's racist, sexist, discriminatory attitudes in ways that is really unhealthy for them, but also for all of us as well as communities. And so the fact that we hear people saying, you know, we can't afford to eliminate poverty, when in fact poverty costs us way more than if we actually addressed the issues that cause people to be living in you know, abject poverty, that we can't afford healthcare, when in fact if we addressed, you know, everything from housing to clean water to sustainable and food security, sustainable development and food security, that we'd actually have healthier people, happier people, and we wouldn't be costing the healthcare system as much as we do in emergency care, because people wouldn't need emergency care as much. And so the fact that we don't unpack that more and make those commitments, I have to say is, you know, I'm not trying to be, you know, stupid here, but I actually don't understand why we don't unpack it better for folks, because when we unpack it and we understand it, we see the logic in it. And not only that, but we see that it's about caring for all of us, that if you know, and the pandemic, you know, I keep coming back to that, in health ways has shown us, if, you know, if one country, one community is not doing well, it impacts all of us. Now, not all of us in the same way, because those of us who have the privilege of housing and ability to have the supports, the equipment and the personal space and the healthcare to ward off or to get vaccinated, all of those things are better off. But we know that if we're not taking care of everybody, that ultimately they, you know, it will impact, if not us individually, it certainly will impact our communities and our country and our world. And so I wish I could be more help. I really don't get why people aren't understanding. I mean, maybe you guys can tell me, like, what is it we're missing telling people? I think people have historically operated in more individualistic, selfish, and I mean that in the sense of self-interest ways, than in ways that are interested in preserving and upholding collective rights and promoting collectively our interests. And that, to me, is what substantive equality is about, and then what we should be doing, which is pulling everybody up, not just those who have already have the most. And so maybe it's because those who already have the most are fearful of losing. And the reality is that if we actually, probably, I actually would be okay with the richest people in this country and the world who have made billions and tens and hundreds of billions of dollars during this pandemic, like the Amazon gurus and the, you know, all these folks. I would be okay with them paying more of that to fund these sorts of services. But their self-interest is to keep it to themselves, or to decide who they can show their largesse to and give money to. And I think we need to fundamentally disrupt that. And I think young people are doing that in ways that my generation is not.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I always say that I think like billionaires are a policy mistake because it doesn't make sense to me. Like maybe like $1 billion, fine, like keep it, but a couple $1 billion, like what are you doing with that? I don't see the like, and I get really confused because I also watched the American election, especially like the Capitol riots, and I looked at the people who were running into like the policies that like they were running into like the Senate to like stop like or to Congress to stop were benefiting their communities. But like it's like this like cognitive dissonance that is occurring that I I genuinely feel so confused as to when did conservatism go from like individual decision make like it was like, you know, like the government shouldn't be involved in every little decision that people make to like the climate scientists are wrong, scientists in general are wrong, women's bodies should be governed by the state, not by the person whose body it belongs to, like that immigrants who bring so much to our country and can do so much for us, um that they're a problem, or like I just or like it just I don't know how to unpack that or where to go because it feels like um when you try to engage in a conversation about it, it's like heels dig in instead of like
Mhm.
an openness to like discuss the future. uh,
Mhm.
yeah, I feel like the rise of the alt-right really scares me, even though you see a lot of young people not really falling into that. That's not to say that there isn't. um yeah, I don't, I mean, like, do you think there's a role of government in dealing with that, like in
Oh, I mean, I think we have a huge responsibility. The disaffection with government and the lack of faith, I think sometimes is reinforced by those of us in government. If we say we're going to do something and then we don't follow through, then how can that not create some distrust? If we say, that, well, for instance, climate issues and environmental issues, if we say this is damaging the environment and then we don't act, just try and stop it, then it looks disingenuous. It is disingenuous. And, some folks rightly call it, lots of folks rightly call it out, but some folks may see it as, see, it wasn't really true in the first place. And I think that's the scary part, is when you see people, like I remember when some of the first policies, racist and, really um, multi-conservative fiscal policies were brought in. It was all on the backs of poor people, saying, poor people were costing us tons of money. No, poverty was costing us money. And creating more ways to make more people poor was actually hurting more people. But I can remember people saying, "Oh yeah, they put in things like snitch lines here in Ontario in the early 90s." Now, the snitch lines were designed to have people report if someone was committing welfare fraud. There was this big crackdown. They're going to deal with welfare fraud. The snitch lines ended up being eliminated. Why? Because 90% of the calls to those lines were about people who weren't even on social assistance. So at the time, I didn't have a car. Let's say my neighbors were great. I'm not suggesting my neighbors would do this, but let's say my neighbor sees me riding my new bike that my friends got me for my 50th birthday. And I think, that Kim Pate has a new bike. She must be committing welfare fraud because she's on. Now, I wasn't on social assistance. But if they call in and there has to be an investigation, it was costing something like $200,000 a month to investigate 90% of the people who weren't even on social assistance for fraud that was a fraction of that. And when I say fraud, I mean like people getting more than they were entitled to, often by mistake, and then being penalized for it. We know that there is nowhere in this country that people can live on social assistance and get by. There is just nowhere.
Mhm.
It's criminally low social assistance rates. And yet the perpetuation of this myth that somehow all people are committing fraud, when in reality, what we're doing is creating infinitely criminalizable people. That if you're poor, then if you are monitored, you could be detected doing something that is considered wrong. Like I've known women, I say women because it was predominantly women I was working with as these policies came in the 1990s, who were criminalized for getting groceries from their parents. They were single moms with kids. They would go for dinner, their parents. They'd get a bag of groceries. And one woman, Margaret Little, who teaches at Queen's, or she's probably retired now, documented in a book. Now I've just forgotten the name of the book. But she documented how many women, in particular single moms, were being criminalized for so-called welfare fraud, overpayments, and having their money clawed back, being kicked off social assistance for things like getting groceries that they don't declare, getting, a gift of a pair of runners for their kids, the sorts of things that we know people need to get by, but weren't possible. And so, you can't get, it's not sustainable. And when I did, a couple of speeches in the Senate on how much it cost, how much people have, the fact that most people pay more for a coffee, one cup of coffee in a day, than people on social assistance get for the entire day for food, people were like, that can't be right. And when I say the amounts, $800, $700, $1,300 for a couple and with a kid, they'll say, well, how could they rent a place? Well, yes, 90%, in 90% of the communities in this country, people working full-time at minimum wage jobs can't even afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment, let alone people on social assistance. And so, the intersections of these are, to me, so clear that I don't understand how people don't understand that. But then you have people who are in those situations too, feeling like the stigma that attaches, they then sometimes become part of the argument against their very own self-interest or their own community of interest. And they'll say, yeah, it's all the welfare bums that are giving us a bad name. And I'm saying, when I'm talking to folks, I'm saying, they're talking about you. They're not, it's not some mythical. They're talking about everybody on social assistance. I say, no, it's the person over here who's doing, and sometimes then it will take on other kinds of discriminatory attitudes against racialized people or Indigenous people. And so I think we do have to expose more of where the misinformation is coming from and challenge it in ways that and inspire people to rise up to a better, not sink to the lowest depths, but to rise up to argue for a better, not just another ceiling, but a better floor for it. And I often say our social assistance and our health, we need to get rid of, so I personally think we should get rid of social assistance and have guaranteed livable income. And by that, I mean something that is that allows people to rebound out of poverty, not to get stuck and ensnared in poverty in the way that our current schemes do.
I like all of that. I just want to retweet it. I feel so strongly about all of it. Something a friend pointed out to me recently was how involved corporations are in a lot of the creation of, not all corporations, but like big businesses, like large people with large buckets of money. Like, we know now that a lot of the things around global warming were combated by big oil companies or fossil fuel companies that wanted to like they would pay scientists to say the opposite of what we were finding to be true, because it served them. And I imagine, and I also know that sometimes textbooks are funded by certain groups where what's written might lean in the favor of like the dairy lobby, or like that like dairy is really needed in every aspect of your meal, when maybe it's not as necessary as I grew up thinking it was. what like how do we discover what is being influenced from that end? Because I feel like we find out about it years later, but in the moment it's a little bit harder to like identify.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because for years, I would not go to certain stores and shop in certain places because, when I was working around the prison industrial complex, obviously I was really concerned where prison labor was being used. And 13th of Ava DuVernay's film points out some of that. But I think we should be putting out more of those lists. I mean, I was shocked. I forget who it was. I found out anyway. But the companies that are actually investing in these approaches, we should be calling out and challenging them. And so for years I wouldn't use certain companies because I knew they use prison labor, even though it wasn't in Canada. But I thought we should just not support those. And I think we should be similarly laying out, where are all of these? What are the corporate interests in education? That's why I think post-secondary education should be free. I can't believe that, it doesn't impact people, what they're learning when it's being funded by a corporation or a family, a family name that gets put on a law school or a business school or a science lab. And so the fact that it's not publicly funded means that I think it does get skewed in ways that, if you've got a corporation that's funding a law school, how likely is it poverty law is going to be a focus?
Sure. I mean, I would also argue that like the public education system in Ontario, for example, did not teach me about Indigenous folk and civic engagement, but perhaps that is a easier system to dismantle because of efforts like advocacy. But yeah, I would argue that like even an education system can be corrupt, a public education system.
Absolutely. Because if the people in power are predominantly, as we've talked about, male, pale, and stale, as in, privileged old white folk, then the reality is you're not going to get a very diverse understanding of our communities, let alone, the country. And so yeah, I think we do need to keep pushing on absolutely on public education as well. I mean, it's my frustration, is so huge around how much money is being put into private education versus public education. And we should be pushing for those resources to be put into public education, in my opinion. Even though I recognize that, in an individual situation, people's education may suffer because they end up in a publicly funded system that is not well resourced.
Right.
Like right now, that's happening.
So going back to like corporations, like what's the move there? How do we find out if they're involved in decision making? Like I remember in Ontario when certain box stores were staying open, but like small businesses were being closed. I remember feeling like discomfort around that, where I was like, this doesn't fully make sense. Like, I feel like there's a better way to support small local business owners while also utilizing box stores in areas that are so big that like, or so where that's like the best resource to have everything, like in more rural areas or whatnot. But yeah, like I guess I was like really confused about it. But and then later we would find out that that Toronto Star report, what was really going on and the lobby efforts that went in. How do I find out faster, like in the moment, what lobbying groups are involved in decisions that our leaders are making? Because like I thought they worked for me, not like I'm confused.
Yeah, well, and in fact, lobbyists have to register now, and there's it should be a public. But now you're asking this question, I will actually investigate to find out if this is true. But it should be a public record. For instance, the Hill Times, which covers stuff on Parliament Hill, often at least once a year, maybe more, will list who are the most lobbied politicians. And so you can know who's meeting the most with lobbyists. And that doesn't, like, I get approached by lobbyists and I often think, have you maybe haven't done your homework, because I don't have a whole lot of influence over what's happening, but I'm happy to meet with folks. And all joking aside, if it's people who are meeting who want to raise issues around the TRC and the lack of implementation, of course, that's really important. And or if it's youth coming to discuss, education issues, and those are all vitally important. But lobbyists, paid lobbyists, are registered, and we should be looking at who are they meeting with, and if there's kickbacks, those they shouldn't be happening. One, and if they are, we should know about them. And so those are other questions that during this upcoming election we should be, and provincial elections as well, we should be asking is, who are you most influenced by? Where do you get the money for your campaign? Those are really good questions that you're raising this. I'm thinking I've never asked those, but now I will. I'll start asking those questions as well, because we should know who's funding what and who's influencing those decisions.
Yeah.
And yet,
sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I interrupted you. I was saying, during this time, many of us have spent more time thinking about how do we support local business and, family entities and, small community based, not just businesses, but services, so that they don't go under during this time, because that's who's been most significantly and negatively impacted. And so we should be looking at it. But you're right, when I think not, most people thought more about how they benefited. The other thing I'd like to do more of, and I must confess, I don't know enough. If I'd studied economics, I might have learned more. You might see one of the books back here that I've been reading is, well, in addition to braiding sweetgrass and neglected no more, I also was reading Mark Carney's Values, because I thought, okay, how does the world tick? Now he's saying that the leaders of the future need to be working on building a better world for everybody. Now he was head of the Bank of Canada and head of the Bank of England and World Bank, whatever. And he's like, so he's saying, and all rumors are that he's going to be at some point running for office. He's saying that it is the youth. He's also saying youth are leading, and that anybody who's not starting to build on value-based governance is going to be missing the boat.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the economic decisions. As I was reading it, I was thinking of conversations I had when I first started looking at guaranteed livable income. I looked at places like Finland, where they at about the same time as oil was so-called discovered, started being exploited in Alberta here in Canada, they started going after the oil that was in Finland, and their population of Finland was about the same as the population of Alberta at the time. And what they did, instead of the capitalist exploitative approach to oil development in Finland, was they ensured that all of those resources went into the collective good. And so now I'm told, and I would like to go and meet with folks there and experience it, or hear from, and especially if you've got connections there. I'm told that you can go to the most remote fjord in Finland, so the equivalent of northern Alberta, perhaps, and every community has healthcare and educational supports. And they have enough resources now that every single person in the country, if suddenly they could not work anymore, had no ability to make income, could be supported from this point till their death. Now, that's a tremendously different way of investing in your community. And they've done it in more sustainable ways as well, all right? And so more economically, but also most importantly, environmentally, and obviously in terms of human development and human well-being indexes, they're way better than we are. And they talk about things like happiness indexes. Imagine if we started talking that way, that we want our politicians, and so part of me wants to encourage leaders, youth leaders, to inspire political leaders, including those of you who will be becoming political leaders, because I'm hoping some of you will be, to actually aspire to a better way and to actually lead us into a better way that is values-based, that is supportive, that is interested in collective well-being, not just individualistic capitalist ventures.
Yeah, I love that. I wrote the book down. I'm going to read it.
Yeah.
But also, yeah, no, I'm obsessed with some of the policies coming out of Scandinavian countries, and how they look at things like happiness. Like, I feel like isn't that really what we want, is happiness and security? Like, yeah, so insecurity meaning like financial security and stuff as well. But yeah, like just I think that's quite, I love how they look at that. But before we wrap this up, I wanted to ask, just because I'm not sure, is like when we talk about corporations, is that the same as a registered lobbyist, or can you be a corporation like whispering in the ear of a politician and not register?
That's a good question. I suspect you shouldn't be if you're actually meeting with politicians to try and influence policy. That is by its nature lobbying, and you should be registering for that. I do think that there are other people whispering in the ears of politicians because they're friends or they know them from, however, through that are not necessarily being listed as paid lobbyists that should be. So, and for sure, we see the impact. I mean, I often use the example, and you'll pardon me, because I'm getting old and geriatric, if I'm repeating myself, but I may have talked about this before, not this session, but at other times when I've spoken, that a good example is the SNC-Lavalin. Everybody remembers SNC-Lavalin now because of what happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould and the deferred prosecution agreements. Well, when we were passing that law, I was brand new in the Senate, and I kept asking questions. Some of the media came to me afterwards and said, "Oh, we want to talk to you about this." And I'm going like, "Why do you want to talk to me?" And they said, "Well, because you were asking questions when the law was being passed." And I was asking questions because we were putting in place deferred prosecution agreements for corporations who had done something that was deemed criminally wrong. And we were putting in place a way for corporations to say, "Oh, yes, we agree, we did something really bad, it's criminally wrong, but this is how we're going to fix it, and this is how we can make sure it won't happen again." And you get a deferred prosecution agreement. Like, hello, given the work I've been doing for years, why wouldn't we have that in place for individuals who sometimes break laws they don't even know were laws, or they're like trying to navigate poverty, past trauma, racism, violence that they're experiencing. And so the context is one that is vitally important. And if you provide an opportunity for them to take responsibility, say, yeah, this is the plan so it doesn't happen again, and actually have the means for them to do that, how much better that would be. That would be, to talk about one of our last discussions, reconciliation in action and decolonized options, as opposed to continuing on. So right now we privilege corporations. We give them the ability to be persons in law. We let them influence policymaking. We let them get off when they do things that could be they should be held criminally responsible. And we don't do the same for individuals who are more likely to be subject in negative ways to those policies and those practices. So I think there are lots of ways we can move forward. And I'm looking forward to all the ways that all of you and the folks who comment on these sessions, if we have the opportunity to do one in a way that's live that people can directly interact, I'm happy to do that too. I mean, ask me the hard questions. I don't necessarily know the answers, but I will do my best to try and find out if I don't know it.
Yeah, well, I'm going to follow up with you on the question around how to find out more about who has been lobbied and who's, all that stuff, because I feel like that's the competition that the everyday person is up against, is like, will their elected leader listen to me, and my community, or will they listen to a giant corporation? And who are you swayed by? Because it really people like me and people like our community and young adults and just, you know, like humans, not not a giant corporation. So thank you so much for discussing this with us. I feel like a little bit more informed, and then a lot more questions, but kind of fired up to vote, which is really where we're trying to get people to go. So thanks so much, Kim, for chatting with us. And thanks to everybody else for being here. We'll see you next week.
Yes, look forward to it. Take good care. Thank you.